Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. As you already know, this is the Budget Committee. My name is Deirdre Bartman. I'm the chairperson of the Budget Committee. I know we also have new permanent members here with us today. So I welcome Member Bosman to the committee as a permanent member. Thank you. Colleagues, as you may know, the budget, main budget, as well as the adjustment budget has been tabled today before us in sitting. I've checked with the procedural officer. Ms. Glass has sent it out via the papers. By the papers office electronically, and there are also hard copy books. And you may have seen that presentations were also handed out to you. These presentations are based on the books that you have already received. With that, I'm going to start with asking the members in the House to just introduce themselves, and then the members online to introduce themselves. I'll then allow the Minister and HOD just to introduce their respective delegation. I will then allow for brief overview remarks, because respective presentations and documentation. Thank you so much. Members in the House, if you can please introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Chairperson. Khalil Brankes, full member of this committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Cameron Dugmore. I don't think I'm a member of this committee. I'm just a member.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. My name is Khalid Sayed. I'm not a member of this committee, but I'm here to gain knowledge and insight. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair. Wendy Kaiser Philander.
Good afternoon, Gillian Bosman.
Afternoon, Chair, Ms. Ulikama.
Afternoon, Chairperson, Sean August.
Good afternoon, Mireille Wenger, alternate to this committee.
Good afternoon, Chair, Dan Plato.
Thank you so much. I don't see any other members in the House. So I'm going to ask the members online to just introduce themselves, please.
Good afternoon, Chair. Derek America, alternate.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairperson. Allen, alternate member.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Ricardo Mackenzie.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, and to the rest of the members of the committees and those in the House and online. I'm Lula Mamvimbi.
Welcome. Okay, I don't hear any other voices online. So I'm going to then now ask that the Minister and HOD just introduce their delegation, and you can go straight into your overview. And I just want to ask that when you do the adjustment budget, that you also deal with the performance, because they're related is in terms of the last financial year, that we deal with those two together. So that we deal with the performance and the adjustment budget together when we deal with those.
Thank you, Chairperson. My name is David Mania. I'm the Minister of Finance and Economic Opportunities. I do seem to recall the Honourable Leader of the Opposition accusing me of repeating myself during the budget speech, so I don't think that it's necessary for me to make any further remarks. And I would like to hand over to David Savage for the introductions and for the presentation.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Chair. Yes, David Savage, HOD of Provincial Treasury, joined today in the House by DDG Julinda Gantana, who runs the Governance and Asset Management team in the Treasury, and DDG Roy Haverman, who runs the Fiscal and Economic Services team in the Treasury, as well as by Mr. Malcolm Boyson, Ms. Annelies Pick, and Mr. Klaas Langenhoven. And last but not least, Ms. Taryn van der Rede. I think we do have a number of other very interested officials online or watching it stream on YouTube as well, I'm sure. If I may dive then straight into the presentation, I will. Oh, and for our one element of this presentation, we're also joined by Ms. Zinat Ismail from the Department of the Premier when we look at Q3 performance, and she will come in and help with that presentation as well. Chairperson, with your permission, we'd like to go straight to the 2022 MTEF, and then we'll come back to the Q3 budgets. We had initially structured it to cover the adjustments budget as part of this presentation, but it's very easy to flip that to the Q3 presentation, so that's not a problem at all. If we can just go to the first slide there, Paul. Yes, so today the Minister tabled in the legislature 7 documents plus his speech, and they're quite voluminous, and I'm sure members will be aware of that from past experience. The most voluminous are those related to the new financial year and medium-term expenditure framework. So that is the overview of provincial revenue and expenditure, which is a more strategic document. The estimates of provincial revenue and expenditure, which is the very thick blue book, which covers the individual votes of each individual department. A companion on infrastructure, the overview of provincial and municipal infrastructure investment, which gives a more spatialized view of particular infrastructure investment projects and programs of the province. And then, of course, alongside that, the appropriations bill and the Provincial Gazette outlining allocations to municipalities. So that set of 5 deals with the 2022 MTEF. Alongside that, the Minister, of course, also then tabled the 2021 adjustments appropriations bill and the adjustment estimates of provincial revenue and expenditure that goes alongside with it. So just so that members understand the raft of documents referring to 2 different financial years, the one being the remainder of the current year, and the one obviously being for the 22 MTEF going forward. The presentation that we'd like to take you through today, starting with the 22 MTEF, is really covering the budget process and our approach, the fiscal and economic context which this budget navigates, the fiscal framework and our response, and policy priorities and spending plans. I will just quickly make some opening remarks on the budget approach that we've used for this year. It has been a year that has been challenging in the sense that we are still recovering from the pandemic and the deep disruptions to society, the economy, and government's own spending plans that arose from the pandemic. So we have, I think, in trying to build this budget, put considerable emphasis on a continuous basis in understanding our changing context and trying to understand the dimensions of the uncertainties that we've been facing and to chisel away at them as the budget process has progressed. We've tried to cover a lot of that narrative in the overview of provincial revenue and expenditure, the OPRI, but we've gone slightly further than that, in that this year we've taken a very, very sober view of risks, both in terms of how we understand the risks that are facing us, how we integrate that within combined assurance in the province, and then obviously how we respond to those risks. And I think in doing so, we've been very clear that we do need to make sure that we are also focusing on recovery priorities for the province, which I think have been traversed in detail, and we'll certainly talk to it a little bit more. This has required extensive discussion, sometimes very, very technical discussion, to better understand the nature of the risks that we are facing in the province and the nature of a changing context. And so there have been extensive discussions that have been held at political and at a technical level through the various budget processes and engagements that we have through the budget process. But ultimately, all budgets are budgets that require tough decisions to be made. As we like to say in the Provincial Treasury, how are you prioritizing your priorities? Because it's easy to have very many priorities, but it's not easy to give all of the priorities equal weighting and resource allocation. So one needs to have a very sharp focus on what is critical, what must be done in the longer term vision growth and development of the Western Cape. Secondly, we have wanted to demonstrate risk mitigation measures, and by that is twofold in our understanding of risk. The first is we cannot be in a situation where every risk materializes as a fiscal pressure. Risks can and should be understood in advance, proactively managed and mitigated so that they don't become a fiscal pressure. A risk that is left unmitigated and unmanaged can easily become a fiscal pressure and then take resources away from other critical priorities. And ultimately to achieve an informed allocation of resources based on where real needs exist and where real risks require active mitigation in this medium-term cycle. So the 2022 budget process has set about progressively achieving the objective that the Minister laid out in his speech, a budget to push forward in the Western Cape. We started the process of preparing the budget in June. It actually built, that was the formal start of the process, but with our significant exposed frontline services departments, we were meeting with them sometimes weekly to understand their changing contexts in the province. The formal budget preparation process started in June, series of technical engagements, engagements with the National Treasury, executive level engagements, and very importantly, the tabling of the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook, which was then complemented immediately after the local government elections this year with the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook. And that led us to the medium-term budget policy statement. It was tabled in November alongside an adjustments budget, and that was built out of a series of engagements across the province, extensive submissions on spending pressures that were being faced by different departments and entities in the province. And then finally, now the process that has been in this calendar year around preparing the main budget being tabled today in its various with these various documents in the legislature. So I will hand over to Dr. Haverman and the team to then take us through the economic and fiscal context, the fiscal framework and policy priorities and spending plans. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you very much, HOD, and good afternoon to members, to Chair and to members. I'm just going to briefly sketch the global context within which we found ourselves, together with the domestic context and then the local Western Cape context. So I think one of the big stories about this particular year, 2022, is that the global economy will be slowing quite significantly, deceleration, after the boom of last year. And the boom of last year was obviously just a sort of a once-off bounce as the world was catching up. It all depends, and there's quite a bit of analysis in the document about what we call Google mobility trends, showing how busy people are and where they're working and so forth. And we've got some other data on flight arrivals and so forth. But essentially, the global economy is expected to grow by about 4.4% in this year and then 3.8% in the next year. Of course, similarly, South Africa's GDP also bounced back, but is expected to slow back down again to about 1.9% a year in 2022 and 2023. And during the COVID period, there was a significant jump in the unemployment rate, and youth unemployment is a big risk and quite a significant jump to 49.3%, which is a systemic challenge for the economy. In terms of the risks to the South African economy in this coming financial year, obviously the big ones there are rising geopolitical tensions, electricity constraints, rising inflation and interest rates, and who knows, additional waves of COVID-19. So these are the sorts of things that we have to take into account when preparing the provincial budget. We expect the Western Cape economy at this point to expand by about 4.3% in 2021, also a bounce back, but then to slow back down again to 2% in 22 and 1.9 in 23. In terms of the unemployment rate, the latest data suggests an unemployment rate of about 26.3% in the third quarter of 21, and the number of unemployed individuals has increased by 19.9% in to 794,000. When we did the briefing on the PERA, one of the most interesting things, of course, is the change in how discouraged workers and non-discouraged workers are going. But I think we did quite a detailed discussion about that there. But I mean, clearly, this is one of the big things we're looking at, because also the impacts on how we think about making sure we do allocations in the most appropriate way. So in the next slide, then, we just do a little bit. There's an analysis in the document about the risks, the geopolitical risks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the Western Cape. I think the clear big story there is naturally a substantial jump in commodity prices, both commodity prices that we export, which is not necessarily bad for South Africa, so particularly a big jump in gold prices, but obviously significant increase in the prices of things that we import, most notably obviously oil, and that's because Russia is a very large supplier of energy into the world. And secondly, very interesting, and I think the world is discovering how important Ukraine is actually for the production of wheat throughout the entire world. We do a bit of analysis there in terms of how much wheat actually Ukraine and Russia generally produce, and it's quite significant. And the impact of this is obviously a substantial rise in wheat prices, which we're probably going to start seeing coming through and has already started to come through. But also, so that has some positive benefits, particularly for Western Cape farmers. But as a country, we're a net importer of wheat. And so there is a risk of a disruption to food security, both through the price effect and through a reduction in imports of wheat. Then one of the other interesting things in terms of the role of Russia in the global economy is that because of the nature of the underlying natural resources that it has, particularly phosphates and nitrogen, it is actually a very large supplier of fertilizer to the world economy, and actually quite a significant. We import quite a lot of fertilizer from Russia. And so one of the other implications, which also goes to rising food prices, is that there will be an increase in the price of fertilizer, and this will feed through to potential disruptions in the supply chain. So that's kind of one of the big global risks that obviously have influenced our thinking on this. Moving along to the next slide, just talking a little bit about some of the big things that we are looking at. Obviously, as I highlighted, unemployment is a very big issue for us and has big socioeconomic consequences. In terms of looking forward, in terms of developing the budget, is obviously on the top right-hand side, there's this rising population size. The Western Cape is one of the fastest growing provinces as a result of inward migration, which is great for the province, but also means that we need to be very awake to the impact on delivery of services, and particularly, as the Minister highlighted in the budget speech, is very important for making sure that we keep up with delivering of infrastructure, particularly as the population rises. That's sort of the long-term trend. The bottom left-hand one there gives you the short-term trend, which just talks a little bit about what we're seeing right now in terms of Google mobility data. And these are retail and recreation centers in the Western Cape. And that's obviously quite important at a short-term level in terms of understanding how the economy is doing at the moment. That kind of gives you the Western Cape and the economy in context. The following slide just talks a little bit to the national fiscal context. So obviously we prepare a budget in the context of the national budget. The big story coming from Pretoria is obviously reducing the budget deficit and stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio. And that feeds through to provincial receipts, because obviously a large component of national spending is on provincial equitable share and provincial conditional grants, which are then allocated to provinces. That said, national budget revenue remains very buoyant, and that has given them a little bit of space to allocate additional monies to provinces, and we'll go into a bit of detail in a moment about where that additional money is coming from. But there is obviously the question about whether or not this is a long-term structural trend. So if national will be seeing significant revenue overruns for a long period of time or a short period of time, because that will also influence how they think about spending, at least for us, over the next 2 or 3 years. And so there is a little bit of space, which you'll see in our numbers in terms of allocations to the province, in terms of higher than expected revenue collection to fund pressing priorities and narrow the budget deficit and reduce the borrowing requirement to government. Then on the following slide, just to make the point that although there have been additional allocations from national to the province, On the provincial equitable share side, very important, and they say it's only economists that live in the real world. Everybody else lives in the nominal world. But in the real world of economists, real allocations, so that's inflation adjusted allocations to the province, are declining in real terms, which means we get less and less in inflation adjusted amounts to the province. This has quite important service delivery implications. And if you particularly overlay the fact that you're getting less and less, you're not getting the same amount to keep up with inflation that you were previously, plus you're seeing rising population growth, it does create the risk of significant service delivery pressures. And as the Minister was highlighting, fortunately, the Western Cape is in a relatively strong position and can thus adjust to this sort of implication of and make sure that the most vulnerable are not impacted. Then on the right-hand side, we just highlight the fact that provincial equitable share is a large component of our relative to provincial payments, the difference there being obviously own revenue and conditional grants. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Malcolm just to quickly talk us through the provincial fiscal, the budget strategy, Malcolm and Taryn, and just to highlight some of the additional things that we've done, including gender responsive budgeting and citizen engagement.
Thank you. Just with regards to the 2022 MTF, it obviously builds on the 2021 MTVBS. The key principles that we've identified in the 2021 MTVBS is the provision of basic services to unlock allocative efficiency and to enhance productive efficiency, and to ensure that we sustain a long-run fiscal sustainability. In terms of the
ask that you just project a little bit more.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
In terms of the 22 MTF, the budget is obviously aims to sustain the fight against COVID and moving towards increased rollout of the vaccination program, prioritize jobs, safety and well-being to support the recovery plan, and then obviously protect frontline services like education, health and social development. These are also then key in support of the recovery plan, and then making additional resources available for spending on infrastructure and to respond to the fragile state of local government and providing support to local governance, and then to make sure that we get value for money in terms of procurement by stretching our RAN, and at the same time ensure there is transparency in the expenditure through the publication of the disclosure reports, and in terms of mitigating our risk, key environmental risks like drought, fire and flooding, and then in the long run ensure that we maintain long-run fiscal sustainability and by rebuilding our resource. Next slide. In terms of managing our transversal risk, provincial departments are required to manage their risk within the existing baselines through proactive mitigation mechanisms. All provincial departments are faced with significant risk to respond to elevated service delivery demands, while also maintaining responsive, significant uncertain risk. And the provincial budget process therefore prioritized the need to respond to the demand and this risk by making tough policy decisions, given the limited fiscal resources. In terms of our approach, the Western Cape government has aligned the provincial approach to risk management as part of an institutional enterprise risk management process. And in terms of the key transversal risk, it relates to the strategic priorities and it links to the global risk as demonstrated on the slide. Next slide. Coming towards our key transversal instruments in terms of the provincial fiscal strategy, COE. COE is obviously our biggest expenditure item, but we also recognize that our people are our greatest resource. In terms of our COE strategy for 22, it will remain to the management of the COE through the placing of upper limits and the actual headcount management. All departments were also required to develop bespoke COE strategies in finalizing the 22 MTF budget. With regards to infrastructure, it is a key lever for job creation and the economic recovery. This regard, infrastructure investment boost the economy, and there are some short-term benefits which translate to job creation. And in terms of the long-term benefits that will be derived is greater productivity and competitiveness of economic activity. Some of the reforms includes the streamlining of governance reforms, then also improving programs and project preparation. In this regard, the Provincial Treasury has established a bespoke project preparation facility to assist departments with project preparation costs of certain categories of infrastructure projects to improve project preparation, and then also making additional resources available specifically for roads infrastructure. Then in terms of the Fiscal Transition Support Facility, this facility provides fiscal support as a once-off measure and to deal with upfront costs for the investment in new service delivery approaches and technology that will achieve long-term savings and improve outcomes. Then we've also planned to conduct spending reviews as a tool to achieve spending efficiency in a fiscally constrained environment. And during the 21-22 financial year, the following spending reviews were piloted. These relate to learner transport program in the Western Cape, overtime, commuted overtime in the Department of Health, transfers to non-profit institutions in the Department of Social Development, skills programs and projects for youth in business outsourcing. And in terms of the Department of Premier, we focused on broadband. For the 22-22 MTF, the Provincial Treasury will be working closely with departments to assess the efficiency and effectiveness, and spending reviews will cover the areas such as road infrastructure, youth and skills development, and then also the performance of selected programs. And then lastly, also looking at initiatives that are that will impact on improving SEM reforms through the financial recovery. Next slide, dealing with our responsiveness. In this regard, there are two strategies, and that is gender responsive budgeting and then citizen engagement. With regard to gender-based budgeting, the key interventions that will be undertaken by the Western Cape government towards the meaningful implementation of gender-based budgeting is the inclusion of priorities in departmental annual performance plans, the collection of disaggregated data on gender impacts, and then capacity building of individuals within departments to be able to lead into gender priorities. And while departments already continue to contribute to women empowerment, the goal is for each department to be able to produce separate women-specific budgets with funds with gender-specific departmental priorities by 2026. And then lastly, to monitor progress on the implementation of specific programs such as the Sanity Dignity program. With regards to citizen engagement, the key focus here is to build on existing programs like the whole of society approach, and then also through the joint district management approach. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon to the budget members. So as Malcolm has indicated, in terms of our strategies, our fiscal strategies that we are the foundation of the 2022 budget that we're tabling today, is our compensation of employment strategy. As he indicated, it is our largest spending item, but we've also been extremely prudent, and I think the Budget Committee will remember in terms of that we have been for the last couple of years, we've been prudent in our decision making where compensation of employees is concerned. We've made sure that we remain sustainable, and that our decision making for compensation of employees remains within our fiscal envelope. So for the 2022 MTF, the way the COE budget strategy is concerned, what we're taking into account in terms of our approach. So firstly, there is some uncertainty at the national level around COE. This is mainly, if you remember, we are going into a new wage agreement negotiation for the public service, and that would be in terms of the 23-24 financial year. And therefore, the funding for that financial year for the wage agreement is uncertain and is not part of this fiscal framework. We took that into account. Further, we're continuing our pressure on the wage bill, ensuring that there is sustainability. We received funding as part of the 2022 budget process for the 2022 wage agreement. We're doing a bespoke approach where this funding allocation is concerned. We are funding our frontline departments, and then we are holding in reserve until the adjustments budget to see where departments find themselves and the adjustments budget of if they require funding to fund the 2022 wage agreement. Then also in the 24-25 financial year, there's 1.8 billion rand that we have set aside in the reserve. Now, this 1.8 billion is equivalent to the CPI increase for that financial year. But because of the uncertainty in the middle year of the MTF in the 23-24 financial year around the negotiations of wages, we are not sure in terms of what that CPI increases would then come to fruition in the final year of the MTF, or in terms of how National would give us indication how that the wage agreement must be funded. So for that reason, there is a reserve of 1.8 billion then set aside. Then when we look in terms of the bespoke COE strategy for departments, and Malcolm has also then indicated to you that we've asked the departments to indicate how they will maintain pressure on their COE, therefore managing their headcount. What we have then also indicated as part of the 2022 MTF principles, that departments were only allowed to increase their COE or their headcount in this budget if there has been additional equitable share allocations, and if there's been additional mandates or functions that they need to perform in this budget that they did not perform in the previous budget. So then we have allowed for some increase in headcount. So you'll see then that there's a net increase for headcount over the entire MTF. So for the 3 years to come of 1,330. And that is mainly found within our education department for educators and support staff at schools, also within transport and public works for infrastructure and traffic. And then also we found in terms of increasing in terms of well-being interns within Vote 1. There's interns in terms of the provincial treasury in Vote 3, and Vote 14, there's also for drought and municipal support that's increase in headcount. Then the numbers that you see in headcount for the Department of Human Settlements in Vote 8, regarding sustainability of this vote, there has been in terms of a change at the policy level within National, that the Human Settlement Development Grant, the OPSCAP part of that grant, they no longer can be using for COE. And therefore the sustainability of the COE budget then comes into question. This budget then does make the department from paying the COE salaries for this year. We have made sure that they are sustainable for the 22-23 financial year, and over the long term, we will be looking at in terms of number one, ensuring that they stay within their fiscal envelope where COE is concerned, but also the impact that human settlements COE would have in the refresh approach over the long term. So the next slide indicates to you our fiscal framework. And the fiscal framework, I'll just go through the slide then very quickly so that everybody is okay with what the slide is telling us. So this is the fiscal framework that in terms of on the left-hand side is all the different components of the framework. So we first in terms of our total revenue and what the total revenue consists of, our total expenditure, and then also in terms of the reserves that we've set aside. At that stage, we are tabling then a deficit budget, but the funding that we do have in terms of our provincial revenue fund, we're also utilizing funding from there, and therefore that then gives us a balanced budget. Then when we move across in terms of each of those years, when you see in terms of a column that says original, that means in terms of the 22-23 financial year as tabled in 2021 budget. The final then is in terms of the final amount for that component in the 2022 budget, and then it gives you a difference. It also then tallies all the difference in terms of a total MTF. On the right-hand side, it gives you a total MTF in terms of the differences, as you can see there. So firstly, in terms of our fiscal framework, our revenue then increases by 6 billion rand. And that is in terms of increasing in provincial equitable share. The next slide will give you some detail. There's increase on conditional grants of over 500 million. And then there's a reduction on provincial own receipts, and this is in terms of the Department of Human Settlements. That's own receipts has been reduced due to an indication by the Auditor General in terms of how they've been recording their receipts in the past no longer can be recorded as receipts, and therefore their own receipts now in this MTEF is reduced over the MTEF, and you can see that that's the reason for the 225 million reduction on the right-hand side for own receipts. Our total expenditure, then you can also see that is the amount that the minister has mentioned in his speech, the 10.1 billion rand additional over the MTF in expenditure that we are allocating in this budget. And our reserves, we are also having in terms of our reserves, then reserves in terms of a total in terms of 1.5 billion rand in terms of our reserves. When we then look at our fiscal framework in terms of to balance the budget, we are indicating then from the Provincial Revenue Fund that there is funding that is coming to departments as well. So let's go into the detail now in terms of how each of these components are made up of. Firstly, is in terms of the equitable share, and what in front of you now is in terms of how that equitable share changes over the MTF. So firstly, at the right side of this table, it is the total revisions to the provincial equitable share. One of the first changes that you'll see in the second line is that our equitable share has also reduced, and that is a total of 540 million. And mainly due to new updates in the PES formula in the last 2 years of the MTF, and that's a 540 million rand. Then there's also adjustments, additions to the equitable share formula, to the equitable share. And the total adjustments that you see there is in 6.5 billion rand, still on the right-hand side. And that 6.5 billion then is made up of the following. We received funding for the wage agreement, as I indicated in the COE, of 1.4 billion rand. We've also then received additional allocations for social development, mainly for our current welfare NGOs. We've received in terms of the Department of Health, 1.6 billion rand over the MTF, and that is for COVID and essential medical goods and services. We've received 2.5 billion rand for education, and that is budget pressures that is facing in education. And then additional allocations also for education, 798 million rand, and that is for the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. I need to indicate that the funding from national is also in response to pressures that provinces have been indicating as part of the in-year monitoring reporting, in terms of some of the provinces were showing over expenditure in the current financial year, and that would also then carry through into the new MTF, into the new financial year. And this is the response then from national regarding the over expenditures by provinces. We, though, in this province, as I indicated before, some of our prudent decision making on COE, and because we've been able to keep our COE expenditure in line with our revenue, we are not facing that kind of pressures. And therefore, the kind of allocations that you see that we are making in this adjustments, in this main budget, is for the reason because we've made those prudent decisions before the time. So when we then look at in terms of our preliminary equitable share, you'll see then right at the bottom in terms of that gray line over there, that our equitable share then ends up to be 58 billion in year one of the MTF. It goes down, it decreases to 56 billion in the second year of the MTF, and then goes up to about 58.9 billion rand again in the third year of the MTF. That is quite important for you to understand in some of the decision making and some of the slides that you'll see in terms of going forward, especially that dip in the middle year for us where equitable share is concerned. So if you're asking then, and the allocations that I showed you in terms of additional allocations for equitable share, what are we spending our money on? What is our education department and our health and social development going to be doing with that additional equitable share? It's on the next slide. And so it is about protecting our basic services. And that totals almost about 5.1 billion rand. Within education, it is providing us with more educators, and that is also to assist us in for the learner growth that we have annually. It also then gives us an opportunity to make allocations for our foundation phase, and then it also is making allocations for additional classrooms, and then also a phased in for the grade R universalization. Then regarding well-being within health, this is essentially going to our COVID response, but also in terms of addressing some of the surgery backlogs, mental health, and then also in terms of our obstetrics and neonatal services. Regarding our social development, that is going in terms of the funding that we are making available to NGOs. On the next slide, it deals with the details on the conditional grants, and if the details on the conditional grants, the main change in conditional grants in terms of the additional 530 million that we're receiving over the MTF is mainly in infrastructure, and then within the Department of Health, we're looking at increases in the human resource training grant, and then also in the district health program grant. On the next slide. And here you can see in terms of the impact that would have in terms of the various departments. So at this stage, additional conditional grant that we are allocating additional to last year's budget that we tabled, there's 536 million rand more, and it's mainly in the first year of the MTF.
Thank you very much, Annelies. Moving on now to allocative and productive efficiency, and just as Annelies said, identifying the priority areas and the budget priorities. So clearly, the economic recovery plan highlights four big areas for the economic recovery. The first is COVID-19, the second is jobs, the third is safety, and the fourth is well-being. So on the COVID-19 side, we are hoping that we are through the worst. We have, however, as we've highlighted in the budget, retained about 200 million just in reserve in case there's any flare-up again of COVID-19. But clearly, one of the big areas there will be ongoing epidemic surveillance, particularly in the first phase now, as we are seeing what's happening exactly at the moment in terms of infection rates and so forth. Making sure we have an agile and responsive healthing, And then one of the big areas is obviously addressing the backlogs in the healthcare system. So as we all know, a lot of people delayed critical medical services as a result of the hospitals being closed. So there is money made available for that. And then in the longer term is something called mainstreaming the management of COVID-19. So missed out obviously a vaccination rollout and making sure that we finalize particularly the booster shots for elderly people. On the job side, and I'll speak to these in a little bit of more detail as we go through each of these. As the Minister highlighted in his speech, the big area there is obviously ease of doing business, making it easier for people to do business, which will drive the economic recovery, driving a process of investment, work opportunities and skills, making sure that people in the Western Cape have the right skills, so having a set of internships and skills programs, making sure that we roll out the presidential employment initiatives in the most efficient and effective way, and we've had quite significant additional allocations for that, and so we have made sure we're doing that. And then also funding some excellent initiatives on the Year Beyond program, which is a way of bringing in young people into the workforce and also giving them something to do, particularly over the festive season and also just more generally. Economic resilience, as the Minister highlighted in the speech there, obviously the flagship program is something called the Municipal Energy Resilience Initiative, which is providing a mechanism to make sure that Western Cape municipalities are able to transition into finding new sources of energy to make sure that we reduce load shedding, which will certainly have a significantly positive impact on economic growth. And then finally, at the bottom, from the jobs perspective, driving forward a program of infrastructure, infrastructure clearly being, as I highlighted, the big trend for the province is this rising population. So that requires us to have a significant amount of infrastructure as we're going forward over the next few years, but also infrastructure in the very short term brings about jobs because obviously lots of people can participate in the building of infrastructure. So it has a great economic benefit in the short run and in the long run. And there we've got some initiatives around driving new infrastructure in municipalities called CDAF, and then catalytic hospital projects. On the safety side, the big initiative there is actually the last one, which is the Law Enforcement Advancement, the LEAP program, Law Enforcement Advancement Plan program. We've allocated in the adjustments budget and the preliminary allocations additional money for that, and that will certainly ensure that we improve safety, particularly in the city, but also the complementary programs around supporting neighborhood watches. And one of the really interesting things that we've been working on very much in terms of an overall safety plan is actually understanding the interlinkages between what we're doing on the liquor side and what we're doing on the safety side, because often improving liquor regulation really strengthens safety for very obvious reasons. And so we're thinking holistically about the safety priority. And in actual fact, in the book, we do a bit of an analysis where we don't just think about safety in this very narrow way about the amount of money that we send to the community safety department. We actually think about it in a more holistic way about all the other things we're doing about safety. And then finally, along well-being, one of the big things that has come out in the last few months and is a big issue, not only for the province, but generally for the country, is actually mental health. That is a big COVID-19, I guess, symptom. Long COVID has some mental health issues, which is a really serious problem, but also the impact of COVID has had mental issues on people. And so we're putting additional money into mental well-being. So the following slide does the same thing. That's just a prettier version of it. I think I've spoken to all of those items. You know, we can go, maybe in the questions, we can go into the detail about how we've allocated money for each of these priorities across the thing. The last one on the right-hand side is what we call an enabling public service, which is, like I was saying, some of the things is to think about how we do things holistically across the province. So what we call integrated service delivery, which is to think a little bit broader about these things, not just at a vote-by-vote level, approach to local government. And then my colleague is driving, Jalinda is driving the governance transformation, which is an absolutely critical part of ensuring that we have an adequate public service, talent and staff development, innovation for impact, citizen-centric culture, transversal foresight, and digital transformation. Then on the following slide, so that sort of gives you the high-level priorities. On the following slide, what we've done is, this was introduced in an earlier, I think last year in the budget, which is something called the Fiscal Transition Support Facility. The idea, as Malcolm highlighted, about the Fiscal Transition Support Facility is that what it does is it provides funds to individual votes to implement often, I think, very cool things, which are digital, often digitally enabling votes so that they deliver their services better, but they need a little bit of money to deliver services better. And so we allocate it to them following a business plan that they provide to the Treasury, and then that allows them often to reduce costs going forward. And it's quite remarkable how often these are relatively cheap interventions, but they have huge implications. So one of the coolest ones, if you like, which I really liked, was something from the Department of Social Development, which is to literally put cell phones into the hands of social workers. This requires us to also give them data, to give them devices, and a whole range of different things, which they don't currently have the money for that at the moment. But if you do that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that a social worker with a mobile enablement is a lot better than a social worker without. I mean, it seems quite obvious to all of us that have smartphones, but if you're talking about a social worker in a very difficult situation, making sure that they have all these tools available to them when they're doing their job is very important. And we have spoken in the past about things like home delivery of chronic medication, which is one of the big good things that came out of COVID, where we actually now deliver chronic medication to the person, not requiring them to come in. That is obviously fantastic. It's really interesting because it also saves money, because we now no longer need to maintain huge facilities for people to wait for their medication. So those are some of the things that have been allocated money to during the from the Fiscal Transition Support Facility. Then, then the big real story of the budget is obviously this significant expansion in infrastructure investment, and as part of that, we do this every year, but this year I think it's particularly important, is the overview of provincial municipal infrastructure investment, which outlines the infrastructure investment program over the MTEF, highlighting sort of the areas that we're spending in both an aggregate level and on a vote-by-vote level. And to take us through that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Klaas Langenhoven.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, a lot has been said already about the rationale for boosting infrastructure, so I'm not going to expand on that further, but you will see in the slide on the right-hand side, there's a real growth, average annual real growth. If you compare the 6.1% increase annually to the on average, compared to the inflation rate at the moment, the big beneficiaries you will see there in terms of departments is the roads or the transport infrastructure with 870 million on top of the 337 million that was already indicated in the adjustment budget that will be realigned to the new budget 2022. And then education, already also discussed, to cater for also growth in terms of learner growth, to provide additional classrooms and maintenance as a huge increase. Human settlement, additional 60 million, and then we allocated from the project preparation facility as well, as already been referred to, and we will unpack that on the next slide. What projects are benefiting? You will see transport and public works is the main beneficiary, and is really to assist with project preparation to get a better credible project pipeline that we can implement over the medium term. So that's the whole purpose of it. I'm not going to go through each and every project, but it's really project enablement in terms of the project preparation, getting all the feasibility studies and project preparation in terms of statutory approvals and so forth in place. And then on the left-hand side, you will see the other focus area is the PPF, the project preparation facilities, to strengthen the pipeline. And secondly, also in terms of our own processes, National Treasury issued updated documentation, and they're still in the process of updating their own what they call the one IDMS, the infrastructure delivery model, that will be issued shortly. So we will align to that as well. From a provincial perspective, the minister made in his speech the announcement about our own Treasury Instruction 16B. So we will streamline our own processes, regulatory framework, to be in line with that of national. And then lastly, we will also improve on reporting on infrastructure performance to this house. And then if we move over to the next page, it's just a reflection of, that's covered in quite a bit of detail in the overview of provincial and municipal infrastructure and investment book. But yeah, there you see the top projects, programs. You'll see the maintenance, and the reason they come out top, in a lot of cases, some of them is package programs, and it's across districts and so forth. So therefore, they feature in the top, which is most probably a good. If we go down, the focus to a large extent remains to protect the current asset base, and then there are a couple of new projects as well. Like, for instance, the extension of the R300 freeway coming in there. And then upgrading and so forth, like the Hermanus-Gansbaai Road that is under construction already. And then if we move over to the next slide, you will see also there, again, the totals per department. And then we added, you'll see on the fixed infrastructure investment, adding to 3.4 billion almost. Over the MTIF, and then there are additional investment that we also list here as infrastructure, but it's not the typical thing that you will see in the infrastructure, a bit of a broader definition, which include the digital government investment, specifically broadband, and the refresh of some of the IT equipment and so forth, and agriculture in particular as well, ecological infrastructure, economic development. We include the investment in Atlantis and Saldanha, and then the green economy, the 36 that was also mentioned in the budget speech. So all in all, we getting to a total infrastructure investment of 32.3 billion in this MTIF period. And then the second last slide from my side is just the spatial representation on the way it happens, and you will see right in the top, in the middle of the slide, is across the districts. There's quite and that's mainly referring to maintenance programs in education and transport and public works, especially on the roadside and so forth, in the main. And then, yeah, I'm not going to go through each, but also the city of Cape Town. Sometimes some of the expenditure is recorded against the city of Cape Town because it's big projects as well, but and it's reflected against the head office. But specifically in the case of roads and so forth, obviously a lot of that happens across the total province. And if we look at the last side, that just re-emphasizes the nature of investment and where we're spending our money. You will see the bulk again, it's on rehabilitation, renovations, refurbishments, upgrade additions, and maintenance on the left, the greys and green and blue block, and then the human settlements, mainly in terms of infrastructure transfers, and then we will see in the future, moving beyond the current MTF, that the new replacement portion or slice of the pie will increase as some of the new projects, like especially in the health sector, gets implemented. A number of them are still in the planning phase, but as soon as they go on site, then that picture will change quite a bit. And with that, Honourable Chair, back to Annelies.
And so we're coming into landing now, and this is the slide that gives you the allocations for the various votes over the 2022 MTEF. And this is the breakdown of the 10.1 billion rand over those 3 financial years. And so when we're looking at the votes, and I'm looking now at the column in terms of on your far right-hand side in terms of what the differences are. So what are the add-ons? What's the additions to allocations made in the 2021 budget? When we're looking at the 2022 in the 22 financial year. So essentially there is an addition to the Department of the Premier, and I'm just going to highlight some of those main allocations. In the Department of the Premier, it is in terms of for cybersecurity is the main allocation. In terms of community safety, the increase that you see is in terms of us making provision for the LEAP for the law enforcement program over the MTEF. The additions to education and health, we've already covered as part of the equitable share. The ECD function shift impacts the shift from social development to education is leading to the negative that you see in for social development. The human settlements negative amount you see there, I've explained in terms of the own revenue that they no longer can record as own revenue, and the reductions that I showed you as part of our fiscal framework is the main reason in terms of for human settlements. Then in terms of the increase that you see for transport and public works, that 1.6 billion rand that you see is in terms of our investment in terms of for roads, for infrastructure. The increase you see for agriculture, there is an allocation for drought that we have received from National to the value of 48 million rand, which makes up the majority of that allocation. You'll see there's increases to cultural affairs and sport, and that's mainly in terms of for the youth programs, but also in terms of what my colleague Roy has indicated in terms of digitization for the archives is included in the allocation there. The increase you see in local government is in terms of looking at our structures and our strategy around fire and our response to fire as a province. Also looking at our municipal intervention and support, and then also in terms of the Khoisan Act that we are needing to respond to, and so there's funding for that also made available. So that is in terms of the main allocation. So some of the negatives that you might see is in terms of, if you remember, I also indicated that the equitable share did decrease by 520 million rand over the MTF in terms of our allocation letter. So the decreases that you see by various of the departments is the impact, therefore, on that decrease on equitable share. So therefore, the equitable share portion has also decreased. That's why you would see some of those negatives. On the next slide, then it gives you in terms of what a representation of that same amount of money. And as you would expect, in terms of health and education over the MTF and transport and public works, they received the biggest share, the lion's share of the 2022 MTF. On our economic classification, in terms of what we're spending our funding on, the significant part of this slide is this 2 outer years of the MTF. So the 23-24 year and the 24-25 financial year. What this budget then, in terms of our investment in infrastructure, what this has then allowed us to do is to see, you'll see that the payments on capital assets, that's the purple part, that has increased over the MTF from 7% to 8% spending then in terms of our capital spending. And so what we then been able to do is then also contain our consumption spending on COE, and you'll see that that is decreasing from 53% to 52% over the MTF, and that is the shift that we've seen in our economic makeup of our spending, which is in direction that, if you remember from our principles, that is part of the principles we put down for this budget. Then the next slide looks at 22-23 financial year on its own, and this indicates to you where we're going to be spending our 77 billion rand budget for 22-23. Spatially, you can expect in terms of the Cape Metro, we 70.1% is going towards there. Cape Winelands, in terms of 11.3% of our funding is going towards Cape Winelands district. And then also in terms of our per capita spend, the Central Karoo district and Cape Metro accounts for the highest total of our provincial expenditure per capita spend. Lastly, in terms of giving you a breakdown in terms of what the reserves are made up of, and so this was a part of the fiscal framework. I indicated that there is one line on reserves. This gives you the breakdown then of the reserves and how that is made up of in the 22-23 financial year. There is, in terms of funding set aside for unforeseen and unavoidable, I indicated that we have not funded all the departments regarding the wage agreement. We are waiting for the adjustments budget to see in terms of what departments actually need where the wage agreement is concerned. I've also then explained in terms of the CPI component in the 24-25 financial year, the 1.8 billion. We're holding it in a reserve until we get more certainty in the middle year of the MTF around COE. For a rapid and agile response for COVID-19, to continue that response, there's 200 million in 22-23 in a reserve, and then 150 million that we're putting in a stabilization reserve for 23-24. And that is mainly because of that dip in the equitable share that I indicated as part of our equitable share slide. There's a 2 billion rand dip, and we think that that could impact in terms of some of the departments, and therefore the 150 has been set aside for that. The acquisition of property reserve, that has always been there in the reserve, that totals then 182 million over the MTF, and that gives you then the breakdown of all the reserves.
Thank you, Chair. And just to conclude then, all budgets build on their predecessors. And this is no different. I mean, I think that we had made in the adjustment in the main MTF last year, had tried to support the recovery plan over that medium-term framework. We're continuing to try, and I think we are continuing to support the recovery plan and our response to COVID-19 as conditions change with the course of the pandemic. What I think are two kind of big standout points from the budget that the Minister dwelt on in his speech is that we certainly are able to enable our frontline departments in particular to respond to changing contexts. And I think that that's no more evident than in the case of education, where there is significant learner growth, but on top of significant learning losses over the COVID period. And that is felt differently across different age cohorts in the education system. And so it needs to be responded to appropriately. And I think that this budget really does try and assist the department to effectively respond to a radically changed context that it now finds itself in. I think in the Department of Health, as they relook at their service platform, as we hopefully emerge from the worst parts of the pandemic, they're starting to pick up other significant pressures. And colleagues had mentioned, for example, on mental health and mental pressures that families are facing. That hits us in the front line of service delivery, with some of the occupancy rates at our psychiatric facilities rising dramatically. But obviously, you don't just address those pressures at the tail end at the psychiatric facilities. One needs a more integrated approach to do this. And then again, I think this. So in addition to really trying to support frontline service delivery responses, there is a real investment in infrastructure as a long-term enabler of growth and development for the Western Cape. This is built on what I think are smart governance platforms that have been developed in the province over time. So we are going to continue to put that relentless effort into good governance, always looking to improve, sustain and improve our governance platforms, and always looking to find new ways to obtain value for money in every cent that we utilize. Our particular focus here is on supply chain and the procurement system, where we think that there is always going to be scope for us to find savings and efficiencies, and we think that transparency, showing citizens what we are and aren't managing to achieve, is critical to that agenda as well. Alongside that, I think starting to become much more integrated in the way in which we're managing risk at an enterprise level, not just at a departmental level, but at a transversal level in the province. And then finally, making sure that we are able to remain sustainable over the long run through making sure we do have reserves to be able to respond to the unexpected. If we'd not been able to do that when COVID hit, we would have been on our back. But we had built up adequate reserves to be able to respond in real time to the pandemic as it hit us, and we do need to be able to prepare for ongoing uncertainties over the long run, because we are still in a very volatile and uncertain environment. I think, let me just end by saying a point the Minister emphasized in his speech was that with additional funding that's flowing into the system and a big budget that is available to the Western Cape, it becomes even more important that there is effective public and oversight over spending across all of our departments. And so I think at that we are going to be really making efforts to put more information out in more usable ways that really can assist committees on an ongoing basis in critical aspects of expenditure programs. And we hope to learn as to what is useful and what is not useful as we go ahead in that respect as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I did a little bit of a happy dance when I saw the gender-based budgeting and gender-responsive budgeting, because we've been speaking about it for a while. I am going to ask, I was counting here, the last adjustment slide. Without all the headings, the next presentation is about 15 slides. I'm going to ask, let's do that first so that I can open up questions to everything. Because I'm just concerned if I open up questions to the first presentation, there might be questions relating to the second presentation, but then the second presentation only comes later and then we run out of time. So let's do that. Let's continue with the adjustment slide. And or less about 15 slides.
Chair, I'll hand straight over to Annelies Pick.
Thank you, Chair. So the additional adjustments estimates for 21-22, we've been a province that is over the years always in the running for funding at the national level, especially when national reallocates conditional grants between provinces. In this case, the provincial roads maintenance grant has been reallocated. And we have received, we're one of the provinces receiving funding in this reallocation, and that amount is about 43.3 million rand for transport and public works. We've also indicated in terms of which are the projects that we are allocating the funding towards, and the slide gives you the breakdown in terms of the Ashton to Swellendam, and then also to the into Villiers Dorp roads project, and then lastly in terms of just under 700,000 for the resale roads project as well. So there has been a few provinces that have benefited from this reallocation, Chair, and we one of them. The Department of Transport and Public Works has indicated that for the very least that they will be able to have commitments at the end of this financial year for regarding this funding. If you'll allow me straight then, Chair, once our drivers got me up and running. There we go. And we're going straight into the third quarter now of the current financial year's spend on the expenditure side. And so we're looking at as at end of December, we just need to contextualize the spending then, or the reporting period as at end of December. So as at end of December, you remember that the first week of December, we tabled the adjustments budget. And so in the first week, yes. And so this is then giving you then expenditure then as at the end of that, for the end of that month. So as you would expect, we just tabled an adjustments budget. So we have spent at that time 72.5% on average for of our expenditure. We were showing a projected underspending at that stage, about 5.8 million rand. And then also you'll see that in terms of how that breakdown of that 72.5 average spending in terms of where we've been incurring most of our spending. And you'll see that is mainly in compensation of employees and then also goods and services. And then in terms of our capital spend, you'll see at that time our capital spend was sitting at 56%, and you'll see some more detail of that coming out. So when we look at the next slide, when we're looking at in terms of our expenditure and the projected underspending at that stage, that was indicated is mainly within the provincial treasury, and that's within goods and services. At that stage, about 5.4 million, 631,000 in local government on compensation of employees, and then also on compensation of employees, 111,000 in terms of culture, affairs and sport. When we look at the public entities on the next slide, you'll see that as at the 31st of December, the public entities at that stage were showing in terms of a projected over expenditure of 28 million collectively. This is, however, not in terms of a risk for over expenditure. The detail in terms of the breakdown of the 25 million is mainly in terms of within Westgrow, 25.8 million is mainly in terms of a request for surplus accumulation retention by Westgrow. And subsequent to December, that approval has been given by the Provincial Treasury. And then in terms of Cape Nature, in terms of expenditure relating to GMT daily tariffs, and then an underspending by Casidra mainly on the capital assets. As I indicated, we do not see a risk at this stage because of the nature of this kind of over expenditure, that there is a risk in terms of over expenditure by the end of the financial year. When we look at infrastructure on the next page, and if you remember, I highlighted the capital assets overall in terms of where we found ourselves. So in 31st of December 2021, we've spent on average 64.8% of our budget. Our adjusted budget at that, it's amounting to 8.6 million rand. And you can see even when we compare that to the previous financial year, it is lower than the previous financial year. And that is mainly within education and health that you'll see in terms of the low spending where those two departments are concerned. Then on the next slide, it gives you in terms of some kind of feel for the infrastructure pipeline as at the 31st of December. And so in which phases were the various projects in terms of their rollout. And so 45% of the projects were in the preparation phase. The preparation phase then consisting of project initiation, pre-feasibility, our feasibility stage, then also the design or tender phase. So a majority of the projects were finding themselves there. 38% of the projects found themselves in the construction phase, and also whether it's in terms of practical completion or at final completion phase. And then lastly, in terms of the last category of our project pipeline is our package programs and COE. There you can see it's 114 of projects that finds themselves there, and that's mainly maintenance projects. And that's why it's also in terms of the spike that you see where it finds itself about 2.2 billion rand of projects find themselves within within that category. So overall, in terms of our risks on the next slide, in terms of education and health, and as I indicated, underspend, there is a risk of a potential underspending in education and health. As of 31st December, education spent 57.7%, while health spent 50.7% on infrastructure. This obviously would also then impact in terms of our spending on our conditional grants. So some of the challenges in the infrastructure delivery is in terms of supply chain management processes. There's also some environmental impact assessment that has impacted in terms of some of the projects, especially in terms of education, in terms of the contract and professional services provider, how they have performed has impacted the infrastructure spend as at end of December. We have had community unrest, which has then impacted the planned rollout of a project. And then also in terms of COVID, which is still having a knock-on effect in terms of infrastructure. We have in terms of our departments, in terms of education and health, we are in contact with them. They are in terms of looking at in terms of accelerating infrastructure as much as they can in the last quarter of this financial year. But there is still a potential risk of underspending on infrastructure. Lastly, in terms of provincial receipts, in terms of where we find ourselves, when we're looking at the collection of provincial owned receipts by departments as well as our tax receipts, we are in a better position than we were last year. At the same time, we have collected about 2.5 billion rand in this financial year as at end of December compared to last year at about 2.3 billion rand. And mainly you can see that the increases there is mainly in the gambling taxes that we've collected. On departmental receipts, the increase is really marginal, but the increase that we find ourselves in as at end of December was mainly on the motor vehicle license fees that we collected was higher this year than last year. My colleague from the Department of the Premier, Ms. Zinat Ishmael, will take you through the performance side of the information. Thank you.
Ms. Ishmael?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon. Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I am in my office here. Yeah, so what I will be presenting, just the context again of the quarter release as issued. It presents the provincial non-performance data for the Western Cape government departments and the public entities for the third quarter validated performance data. As usual, the standard way in which we are presenting to the standing committee, there are two lenses as to how we look at the performance. It only provides a snapshot primarily on the overall performance data in relation to progress against the quarterly targets, and then secondly provide a snapshot of progress made for the continued COVID-19 interventions. And what we're trying to do, we're actually just trying to show the trend from 2021 and the new COVID-19 interventions implemented by all the organizations during the quarter since quarter one. And then I think it's very important to note, or just as a reminder, that the data shared in the COVID-19 interventions was collated via MS Form survey and then incorporated into the quarterly performance reporting process. And I must admit that departments actually very nicely adjusted and adapted to the survey quarterly and then incorporated it into the quarterly performance that we actually submit to the Department of Planning and M&A. So the performance data was then validated at the time of reporting. Thank you. I think important to note here, it is as I'm sitting in my office and the screen is quite small. So what I can say here, it is the for this quarter, the number of performance indicator targets is 424. And if one look at the percentage of targets achieved, it is 76%. Partially achieved is quite high for the Q3 at 17%, and the percentage of targets not achieved is 6%. So difference, quite a difference to the previous quarter. And I think what is significant to note here is also, if one look at the governance cluster, one actually sees that the partially targets achieved is quite high, and similar in the social cluster. And then if one look further in terms of those departments that have actually achieved well below the average, then one could actually see quite a number of departments in the social sector and a number of departments also in the, or I actually say 2 departments in the economic sector. Thank you. And then if one just look at this bar chart, then you could actually see the Western Cape department's average is 76%. And then one could actually see there is about 6 departments that have actually achieved achieved below the average. And that is for this quarter, I think that is significant to note. Okay, thank you. When one look at the averages or the depart of the view of the entities, the number of performance indicator targets 68. The percentage of targets achieved 81%, and then the percentage of partially achieved 9, and the percentage of targets achieved also quite high, which is actually 10. And then when one look at the different clusters, then one see the quite the Western Cape Gambling Board called 100%. And then the social cluster, one could actually see also two of the entities actually achieved 100%, and there is only about a few entities that actually achieved below the average. But the story to be told, if one look at the bar chart, the next slide, then one can see that that average is actually quite high. It's actually have increased to 81% if one look at the previous quarter, which we actually didn't get an opportunity to present. But in the next slides, I will actually quickly tell that story. Thank you. If one look at a comparison of the performance data, and one look at also at the Q3 of 2021 last year to the Q3 this financial year, we started to share this with the committee simply because during 2020 and the start of COVID, a number of our targets were not achieved. When we came into the 2020-21 financial year, then one could see actually slowly, progressively how our targets actually have improved, and actually now in 2021-22, it is actually starting to nicely stabilize. So if one look at last year as a comparison, then although the print is quite small, but one can see that in Q3 of 2021, the Western Cape Government Department average was about 61%, and Q3 of now 2021-22, the average is actually 76%. So this notwithstanding the number of targets which is actually partially achieved and not achieved. Thank you. Next slide. Yeah, if one look at the public entities and the comparisons between the quarters, then we could see that the public entities last year, it was or previous financial year 2021-22, 63%, and if one look at this quarter 2021-22, it's actually an average of 82%. So just in summary, key observations if one talk about the departments, A total of 394 targets were recorded in quarter 3 for 2021, and in this financial year, 424. So it's quite a number of additional targets that we actually work on in terms of this financial year. So in aggregate, about 70% of the targets was achieved quarter 3, while 76% during this financial year. So a difference of 6% for the same period in this financial year. Okay, so the entities, about 66 targets were recorded in quarter 3 and 68 targets for 2020-21. And if one look at an aggregate, 77% of the targets was achieved during quarter 3 for 2020-21, while 81% of targets were achieved during the same quarter. A difference 4% for the 2021-22 for the same period. So yeah. So when one go and look at the COVID responses, the interventions by the Western Cape government, just as a reminder that this started already in 2020. And then when one looked at the last financial year, there were 57 interventions that we reported on during the current financial year. And 48 of those interventions were actually carried over from the previous financial year. And now 9 interventions were actually introduced during this financial year. So even if we are kind of out of the first wave, the second wave, there are still incrementally new COVID interventions implemented. We religiously report on these interventions. The progress on these interventions are reported on collected on quarter on quarter until completion. The status is as follows. Quarter 1, 10 interventions completed. Quarter 2, 8 interventions completed. And now during quarter 3, 2 interventions were completed. So in quarter 4, the progress of 37 interventions will be reported on unless new interventions are introduced. So in the following two interventions will be reported. The following 2 interventions were completed in quarter 3. That is the Department of Agriculture, where they speak about the transformation farmer protection, and Wesco reduce red tape. So these two completed interventions are really contributing. These 2 completed interventions all contribute towards the humanitarian relief and the food security and the economic recovery, as well as to the economic recovery of Western Cape hotspot themes. So the spatial location of these 2 interventions confirm the impact areas across the whole of Western Cape government and not in a specific municipal areas. In addition, these interventions also contribute to the job priority in the Western Cape recovery plan. Thank you. And what I can also share with the committee, if one look at where we are now in terms of quarter 3, then and how we progressively actually improve on our performance, then in quarter 1, the departments are actually had an average of 75% across the Western Cape government. In quarter 2, there was a slight dip, was 74%, and then it actually increased up to 76% in quarter 3. The public entities in quarter 1, average of 77%, it increased in quarter 2, and a slight dip this quarter, 81%. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ishmael. Colleagues, what I'm going to do is, I want to give as many people as possible time to ask questions. I'm going to allow 2 questions per person. I'm going to take the first round of questions. Please indicate if it's on the main budget, the adjustment budget, or the 3rd quarter specifically, so that the officials are able to also assist you with the respective answers. And please also just a reminder that the quarterly performance is on Q3. We are still currently in Q4. So in case anyone was wondering, we're still mid-March. So the last quarter's performance we will get after March. Because I know this is a question we received previously. I just want to clarify that up front. Okay. I see one hand. Member Ms. Kamish Ahmad is assisting me with the hands online. Okay, I see Member Mackenzie's hand also online. Is that one hand? Okay. In the house, I saw Member Dugmore's hand and Member Brinke's hands. And then online, I saw Member Mackenzie's hand and Member Mvimbi's hand. I'm going to allow 2 questions each. For now, I will allow for another round after those questions. Colleagues, I am going to ask, please do keep your questions brief because I do know that members are quite interested in this documentation, and I would like to give as many members as possible the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you so much. So in that order, with the members in the House first. Thank you.
Chair, thank you. Also, thank you very much to the MEC and the departmental officials for all the information provided and all the work done to result in these tablings of today. If I could just refer firstly to page 7 of the presentation on the main budget, the budget allocations. At the bottom, there's a reference there to unemployment having been at 26.3% in the third quarter of 2021. And then that since the second quarter of 2020, the number of unemployed individuals increased by 19% to 794,000. So what I want to ask was if we could just get a figure, that unemployment rate of 26.3, what was the physical number of unemployed people on that date? And the 794, I would just like to know what was the number of unemployed people as of the third quarter 2021 when it stood at 26.3%. And then if you go over to slide 9, this will be my second question for now. There is, these slides which talk about drivers of Western Cape population growth, the red being natural, and then the blue being net in migration. And then it says there in the first bullet of that slide, the one in the bottom right corner, that for the period of 2016 to 2021, Western Cape are estimated to experience the largest inflow of migrants, approximately 470,000 individuals. Whereas if you actually look at that graph, for 2016 to 2021 and the blue, it sort of goes to under, it's on 300,000. If you can see what I mean, it's not 470. It's actually slightly under 300,000. So I'm just, if you could just please clarify where that comes from, because the slide itself indicates that in those years, the in-migration was at under 300,000, whereas the narrative says 470,000. And then if I could just ask, if you compared that to Gauteng in the same period of 2016 to 2021, how many, in terms of the Gauteng population, what was the gross number and percentage of Gauteng growth due to net in-migration in that term, in that period?
Thank you so much. Just a reminder that slide is in millions, not 100,000.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, yes, also to the department, thank you very much for the work being done in the department. On page 18 of the main budget, Chair, see the surplus deficit, it comes out to about 5. Is it? Am I audible? I see on page 18 of the main budget, the surplus deficit is indicated there. The total difference is 5 billion. I could ask the department to explain that in terms of the educational budget for that year, how much of the educational budget was spent and how much surplus money was left from that budget. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you. I think we're going well. Member Mackenzie and then Member Mvimbi.
Thank you, Chairperson, and also Chairperson, I can also express my condolences to Mr. Michael Spicer's family and the board on his recent passing. Yeah, it's terrible. He was a great gentleman. My first question would be to the Minister directly on his engagement with the sector. And the first question is, we've recently seen reports, given the certainty of the uncertainty of where our economy is going, of bread prices reaching 30 Rand in the next 3-4 months and the fuel price reaching 40 Rand per litre, so almost 23 Rand now. Is the contingency reserve enough to assist government? We know our hospitals and our schools use a lot of bread, and our government motor transport use a lot of fuel. Then the second question would be on his speech, page 12, also page 13. The 36 million and the 30 million Rand, respectively, the 30 million Rand on page 13 to strengthen forensic investigation capacity. Will that in the municipal space, will those money be allocated to municipalities, or is that what the Western Cape government is going to spend? So the 36 million Rand for electricity, is that what the Western Cape government going to spend? And the 30 million Rand, or will those be allocated to municipalities? That's my two questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Member Mvimbi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you to the department for the very comprehensive presentation. I'm not gonna deal with the one of the third quarter presentation. I'll rather just only concentrate on the budget, especially in view of the restriction in questions. Chairperson, for now, while I would have loved to ask a question on public participation, but I think for now, maybe let me just confine myself to the two questions really I would really like to ask there. Because the process that was outlined by the department, it seems to be lacking in terms of actual public participation, but I'll leave that for later if you allow us on a round around. There is quite a number of, if you look at the budget in general, there seems to be, of course, quite rightly so, or good concentration on the frontline services in terms of health and education. And basically, when it comes to health, we even got quite a substantial amount of money from the equitable share for purposes of health. I just want to check whether in this budget, is there an allocation or some money set aside for the Khayelitsha district health in terms of the general health budget? Will there be an allocation that is actually put aside for that? The last question then, Chairperson, as my second question is I know in one of the presentation we had with Treasury, there was an item or a project that they raised, which was called the Neighborhood Development Grant, although it's normally a national department funded project. Is there any allocation on this budget for a project of that nature? Because I was patiently waiting to hear maybe you might mention something to that effect. For now, then, I think let me just confine myself to that, Chairperson.
Thank you so much. I'm loving this new system. Minister HOD, I'm going to allow you to allocate those 8 questions, and then we're going to take another round of questions.
Great, thank you. I'll hand over to Dr. Haverman on Honourable Dugmore's questions on unemployment and drivers of population. Just to add, though, that I think that the reference in the slide is to the largest of the time cohorts. It's not comparative to other provinces. I'm not sure if that was one of the implicit questions there, but we can certainly provide further information.
HOD, I just want to quickly, it's on the slide, is slide 9.
We're on slide 9.
So there's 2 boxes on slide 9. The bottom slide says approximately 470,000 individuals.
Yes.
Okay, and the top slide by 2016, there's the little graph there, and 2021 little graph by the number.
Yeah.
That was what the question before. That.
Yes.
And also then comparison with Gauteng.
Yes. So I was responding more on the comparison with Gauteng issue, because I don't think that this was attempting to make an interprovincial comparison. I would expect the Gauteng numbers to be larger, just because of the size of the conurbation there. But Dr. Haberman can go further on that. Ms. Pick, on Honourable Brinkhuis's question on education, in terms of spending levels on education and how those are smoothed over the years. Honourable Mackenzie, the contingency reserve in the context of COVID, we have certainly boosted that reserve because we expect to be in a position of unpredictability. So while if you were to take our average historical cost of disasters in the Western Cape, it would run at around 300 million rand of unforeseen and unavoidable a year, not every year, but over a long run historical average. We're running a considerably higher surplus this year over this medium term than that, not surplus, reserve for unforeseen and unavoidable expenditure, contingency reserve for that. With respect to the allocations for municipal forensics, those are definitely not to municipalities. Those are to build forensic and legal services capabilities in the province, which do assist municipalities. That's precisely what they do, but it's in-kind assistance. It's not a cash transfer. And the same with the MERS at the moment. The Municipal Energy Resilience funding is not directly to municipalities at the moment, although it is possible to convert that into transfers to municipalities once those projects have reached an adequate stage of maturity. They're not quite there yet, although that's obviously a priority. And then on the Khayelitsha district hospital, Roy, I'm not sure if you can add there. District Health from Member Honourable Mvimbi. I will answer the question on the National Neighbourhood Development Partnership Grant. You're quite right, Honourable Mvimbi, that is a national grant. The most similar thing that we have and the City of Cape Town is a beneficiary, as are some of our other municipalities of the NDPG. Our equivalent, closest equivalent here in the Western Cape is the Regional Socioeconomic Projects Program, RCEP, which is managed by the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning, Vote 9. So that would be, and there are projects to that on that program that are still underway. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you much, HD. I mean, on the relative migration trends by province, actually on page 62 of the OPRE, what we do there is we give a breakdown of the analysis, which shows you where, using the data that, I mean, it's quite difficult data to try and identify because trying to understand these flows is quite difficult because it's all based on sort of survey data, particularly from the labour force survey. We don't have a census quite yet. The census is coming up quite soon. But there, what we do is we give where the flows of migrants come from and where they go to. And quite correct, the Gauteng province obviously gets the largest flow of migrants, I think followed by the Western Cape, if I can see the picture correctly there. And there the estimate is that the Gauteng is about 1.5 million from within the country migration, followed by the Western Cape, and then from Northern Cape gets the least and Eastern Cape gets the most. Interesting enough, the main flows are to Gauteng is actually mainly from outside of South Africa. So the net migration trends into Gauteng from outside of South Africa, we get a much smaller share of that, but most of our inbound migration, according to this picture, appears to come from the Eastern Cape, I think is how it works. So there's a breakdown there. We also have quite a big breakdown in the Pero on the migration trends, because it's obviously quite an important issue, just understanding, particularly as growth takes place through the province. Then on the physical numbers, I think, Honourable Member, your question related to the physical number of unemployed people that got us to the 26.3% growth rate. So according to the labour force breakdown in the third quarter, the population of 15 to 64 years was about 4.8 million. Labour force was 3 million. Employed was 2.2. Then, as we highlighted, unemployed was 794, which is up from 612,000 in July to September. Not economically active was 1.8 million, discouraged work seekers 85 million, and other 1.7 million. There, the most interesting thing has been how volatile the discouraged work seekers numbers are from quarter to quarter, because what's been happening in the labour force is people are going in and out of the labour force as a result of different conditions from a COVID perspective. So the people are obviously, it's actually become quite difficult to estimate an unemployment rate per se, because people are just not working and not going into the labour force at the moment. And so it looks like we're coming back down to sort of normal statistics there. One of the most interesting things, it seems as though there's been an increase in the labour force participation rate over that time, which does suggest that people are coming back into the labour force, but we'll see more of those pieces of information as we go on later. Then on the Khayelitsha question, I wonder if we should hand that over to Klaas, if he's got a breakdown on the Khayelitsha question, or no additional data on that? No.
Annelies?
Regarding slide 18 and the question around education, I just want to just take it back in terms of slide 18. So slide 18 gives us, in terms of our total revenue, is amounting, the additionals to revenue amounting to 6.3 billion rand. Our expenditure is 10 billion rand. We have set aside reserves of 1.5 billion rand. So there is, in terms of a budget deficit of 5.3 billion rand. So there's a budget deficit of 5.3 billion rand. I just then want to indicate in terms of how I'm interpreting the question, Chair, if you will allow me. So I'm interpreting the question in terms of regarding education around the budget deficit. What is being funded for the education portion? So what of the deficit is laying within education? If that is what I'm trying to get in, because there's a budget deficit, and what this indicates is in terms of how it's being funded. So,
Brankhuis, is that correct? The interpretation of your question? Is the interpretation of your question correct? Because Ms. Annelies wants to answer, but she just wants to make sure she has the correct question in terms of deficit.
I can repeat. I can repeat. All right. So the 5.3 billion that is indicated is a deficit on slide 18. All right. Yes. So from our revenue, and we've given our total expenditures, that is 10.1 billion rand, and our reserves. So after we've taken that into account, that there is, in terms of a shortfall of 5.3 billion rand for our budget that we're tabling now. The relation to education, I'm asking then, because the member indicated the 5.3 billion rand shortfall deficit, then and the relation to education, is the member asking in terms of what part of that shortfall relates to education? That is my question. I'm just getting clarity.
Okay.
All right. So what part of that shortfall? So of the 5.3 billion rand over the MTF, we have then a shortfall, like I said, over the MTF, we have a shortfall of 5.3 billion rand. So within education, in terms of how that is made up of, is in terms of over the MTF is 1.4 billion rand. Of the 5.3, 1.4 billion rand is with education. Now, that shortfall, just that we can also understand in terms of the shortfall is coming from Provincial Revenue Fund. But in terms of the Provincial Revenue Fund, what funding is in there is in terms of every year's underspending of previous years, over collection of taxes, of our gambling taxes, for example, is actually laying in the Provincial Revenue Fund. And so that's why it becomes a source of funding for us. So the gambling taxes then that we actually receive, that actually funds a portion of education. And that is why of the 5.3 billion rand, 1.4 is with education, because most of it comes because they get funded from gambling taxes.
Then just to pick up on a few issues from the Honourable Ricardo Mackenzie, I think the HOD responded to, I think, a substantial part of the question. But yes, we are satisfied that with the Provincial Reserve for Unforeseeable and Unforeseeable and Unavoidable Expenditure, which is calibrated, it's been a long weekend, which is calibrated at an average of about 439 million rand each year through the medium term. It's actually calibrated slightly higher than what we have been able to provide in the past, and we are satisfied that it is an adequate provincial reserve. The 30 million, as the HOD says, is not allocated to municipalities, but is in fact divided between Vote 1, the Department of the Premier, and Vote 14 is at the Department of Local Government. Then there was a question on whether any money had been allocated to the Khayelitsha in relation to health, and I see that there's at least one project for the revitalization of the Khayelitsha CDC in the amount of 225,000 rand, which will be spent over the MTF. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Chair, just to add on the Khayelitsha side, I see that there's also another project for an acute psychiatric unit in Khayelitsha as well over this MTF for a total cost of.
Is that in the infrastructure book?
Yeah, that's all in the infrastructure book. And I was going to say this is obviously we look at program 8 in the health department to find all of this information as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Member Mvimbi, I know you had an extra question, so I'm going to start with you in terms of questions, and then I'm going to allow for another round.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Again,
I remember Mvimbi, I'm just taking hands.
Oh.
The few with you now, you're going to be first on my list, don't worry. Other hands? If none, then I'll go last. Thank you so much in that order. Member Mvimbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. On the general question, really, I wanted to ask is on the issue of, I saw during the presentation when the HOD was making the process, how the budget gets to be developed. But I really could not get anything that is kind of public participatory where the public is actually involved, apart from the fact that the public is only being invited via newspapers, you know, to be informed that if they want to make input. And we know that the recent was only for, it was advertised on Friday and then on Monday. But apart from that, is there no other involvement of stakeholders on the budget process of the provincial government, just like the local government does with their IDP processes. Thank you, Chairperson.
Member Wemby, is that question to us as committee or to Provincial Treasury? Because we also have different processes.
No, Provincial Treasury, because they formulate the budget, they are leading the budget process.
Okay, so in the putting together of the budget.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Member Dugmore?
Thanks. Just if maybe Chairperson, we could just ask one of the officials who indicated a certain page on a certain document about the other migration. We've got so many documents in front of us. We would just get, it was that one, the overview, and it was page 62. Thanks. On the overview, page 62. Okay.
Chair, you obviously read our documents very closely. It is on page 136 of the PERA, in case you are.
It's 136 of the PERA.
Let me check. 124, sorry, 124 of the PERA.
124 of the PERA, okay.
But that's where the table said
It's in the OPRI on page 62, and this is the exact same information that was also in the PERA, and was also the exact same information from Stats SA in the budget workshop.
Okay, but the point is that in fact the phrasing is incorrect to say the largest, because in fact the largest in migration was Gauteng, but it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. But my question is related to the slide. Sorry, page 17, the approach to compensation of employees in the 2022 MTEF. Now, if you look there, the column that says 22-23, the total is 92 billion. And then there's quite a dramatic drop to 90 billion in 2023-24, almost literally 2 billion. So if you go up, you will see under health, there's a massive drop there from 36 billion to 33. So I just wanted to ask, could that be explained? Because that's, a massive drop of 2 billion for one department. I'm just trying to explain, where would those reductions come from? Because it's a huge drop in 1 year. And then just in the narrative there's a net addition headcount of 1,330. I just want to know if I understand this correctly, that the posts over the entire MTEF period will only increase by 1,330, and those will be mainly in education for educators and support staff at schools. That's it. So the only increases we'll have over 3 years literally is 1,330. Okay. I think those are my two questions, Chair. I have to stop there. I'm going to.
Thank you so much. My questions, let me just see. I don't see extra hands online. Okay. My questions relate. So obviously, we were all waiting with anticipated breath whether the Constitutional Court would agree with the Supreme Court of Appeal in the Agribusiness versus Treasury, National Treasury, regarding the set-asides and so on, and whether it's constitutional. Now been found to be unconstitutional, those particular preferential procurement regulations. Now what? So that's my question. My question is now what? Because we saw some directives from National Treasury, and the National Treasury said, no, it's just advice. So what is the province doing? Now what? And also then in terms of that public procurement, how is the change in 16B infrastructure going to impact on the procurement cycle? Because infrastructure also relates to some of those things like set-asides and localization, and if the public procurement regulations aren't valid anymore, now what? Then I want to talk about sprinkane. So in the Central Karoo, there are locusts. It's a national plague. It is literally, I've driven through it myself personally. It's a national plague. I saw in the budget that we're getting extra money for disasters. I only heard the word drought. I'm not sure whether the disaster money is. Because, for example, the locusts are already in Laingsburg. I drove through a swarm of locusts in Maritzburg. The locusts are everywhere in Beaufort West. And the people were supposed to spray the locusts with the gifgoeders, are supposed to be specially trained by the national government. So you can't just have, for example, an EPWP worker that walks around the town and goes spray the locusts. It's only in the morning and in the evening. Langsburg, for example, there's no one that is trained to do it. No one. I'm like on 3 WhatsApp groups and the farmers are panicking because the locusts are eating everything. Coming from other provinces, it's a national plague. Is this disaster management money? You said something about 40-odd million rand or something that we're getting. Is it going to help us with the locusts? Because the Karoo has been through drought, it's been through economic recession, it's been through COVID, it's been through floods. Ons kan nie nog die locusts ook hanteer nie, asseblief. Please assist us. Thank you.
Chair, as you know, I take my work very seriously. I prepare intensively, but I'm absolutely not prepared to answer your question on the locusts. And I hope that the department can add some value. Thank you.
Thank you. I will ask my colleagues to contribute. I think let's pick on the headcount issue in Department of Health. I think you know that one well. And I'll ask Ms. Cantana to help with the triple PFA stuff. The Member Mvimbi, on the question of public participation, we start off the budget process with the PERO and discussions around the PERO, which happen right across the province, and then we take that forward with our discussions in the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook. And in those discussions with varying role players, we get a lot of intelligence and interaction around issues in the budget that should inform our thinking. Our departments do the same thing, and I was always at pains during this last year to point out to my colleagues that we've just conducted one of the most extensive public engagement exercises, democratic public engagement exercises out there, which was the election of our school governing bodies. That we have also recently done the same with our clinic committees. So what we are increasingly looking at, and we start to discuss some of this in, I think it's around page 115 of the overview of provincial revenue and expenditure, is modalities of citizen engagement or public participation that are really focused on where it makes the most difference to people's lives, which is often at the school and the SGB and the school budget, the budget of the school or the budget of the clinic. And we will shortly be gazetting the allocations to clinics and schools, which I think are one of the most valuable pieces of information that we do publish for parents, for health services users, and so forth. We are also looking not just at the budget inputs, but also at what are the tools that citizens have available to them to engage with government, with officials in terms of improving the quality of services that are before them on an ongoing basis. They are very, globally, there has been a lot of development in the use of what they call social accountability tools, which can be things like balanced scorecards or what they call social audits and so forth, that can actually play a role not just in the planning of expenditure, but also in the oversight of how effective that expenditure is. So we're looking, and that discussion, I think, in the OPRI tries to lay out some of the evolution of where we're trying to take that beyond just I think a concern would be that just broad public hearings on a big Department of Health budget are not that is province-wide is not really going to engage citizens in a particular locality, like Amelanstein in the Kannaland area. They want to know about their clinic and how that clinic services are going to improve to meet their needs. The discussion in this regard is going on at a transversal level, led by the Department of Local Government, because a lot of what this is about integrating our interfaces, communities with municipalities, because we do understand that municipalities see one government that they need services from, that they want to be responsive to their needs. question on the locusts, what I can say is that I am very aware that our Department of Agriculture is alert to the issue, and they have been for some time because those swarms have been moving down from the north. It is not yet declared a disaster in this province, and so that disaster funding is not yet unlocked for that purpose. If it were to be declared a disaster, then the funding that starts to unlock the funding associated with it. But our Department of Agriculture, I think, would be best placed to give a very accurate description on exactly what is happening with locust swarms and what the management responsibilities are, where they reside, and what some of the risks and implications of this may be. But I have no doubt that they're on top of the situation. It's quite interesting when you look at how they manage their risks, which is something we said we're really encouraging all of our departments to do proactively. They are very much on top of these sorts of risks, as well as veterinary risks, animal disease risks, and so forth. On the question of the triple PFA, the Preferential Procurement Framework Policy Act, on the 16th of February, the Court ruled that the Act was unconstitutional, that the regulations in terms of the Act were unconstitutional, and struck them down in their entirety. That creates a problem for the public procurement system, because there are two key aspects of those regulations that are essential for the further operation of the procurement system. Those are the establishment of thresholds when you use the 90-10 or the 80-20 procurement method for the attachment of preferential procurement points, and the evidentiary base that you use for those points, as well as formulas and associated matters. So that was encapsulated in part of the regulations that were struck away for other reasons. We've had extensive engagements with the National Treasury in this regard, led by my colleague Jalinda Gantana, that have tried to urgently request National Treasury to approach the court for clarity on whether that invalidity was immediate or is stayed for a while. And there's a relatively arcane legal point that's at debate here, but is pretty critical for where we find ourselves now. And secondly, to put in place another, big part of the discussions that we had with them was to put in place new regulations through an appropriate process as quickly as possible. So I'm pleased to say that the National Treasury did approach the Constitutional Court on the 4th of March. The court has called for final papers to be filed by the 25th of March. They're also on the 11th of March, or with the regulations. Yeah, sorry, I should hand over to the pro in this respect. The regulations have been published. They are out for the draft regulations are out for comment until the 11th of April. It does leave us with a potential lacuna. Should there be no clarity from the court and the draft regulations are not turned into final regulations for a period, but the position of the Western Cape government is that we need to balance, obviously, our best understanding of what the rules that apply now are, with an absolute imperative of making sure we ensure services are delivered. And so the provincial executive, the provincial treasury, taken measures to say to accounting officers that we should not freeze our procurement system. We do not think that is a viable way to proceed. In fact, we think it's very dangerous and may actually affect citizens' constitutional rights to service delivery if we're unable to procure very basic goods and services. On the question of 16B, the change that the minister was announcing is not to scrap the Department of Public Works and so forth. It is rather to move from having a single infrastructure delivery agent in the province, which is one of the roles of the Department of Public Works, into allowing there to be multiple delivery agents. So at the moment, in terms of 16B, the Department of Education must go to the Department of Public Works to build a classroom or a school. It will now it is the Department of Public Works will remain the preferred provider, but should there be capacity constraints, the Department of Education would be able to use another provider, separate to the Department of Public Works. I think that there's a very important discussion to be had with each of the departments, particularly health and education, on what this added flexibility will give them, because it will certainly give them options in how to pursue infrastructure programs more through more modalities, which should hopefully improve efficiency. It might bring some competition. I know in the Department of Education, one of the things they're thinking of is for well-governed schools, particularly well-governed poorer schools, that can an additional allocation be made to those schools to build in a classroom and so on and so forth within an appropriate rule set in this respect. So they really are actively looking at, if you're going to spend large amounts of additional money on infrastructure, one wants to not put all your eggs in one basket in that respect, because that one basket may not have all of the capacity to respond. But I think that the other net effect of it is, whereas in our system it's been possible to hold multiple people accountable for delivery or not delivering, it will now be very clear that it is purely the Department of Education or the Department of Health, because it is not required to use a single service provider. It's choices it can make in the delivery agents that it wants to use. Before I go to Annalise, if I can just check with Jalinda, because I worry I didn't. Oh, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, members. Maybe just to add, because the HOD provided a comprehensive feedback in terms of what has been done, but the National Treasury also opened the door for organs of state to apply for an exemption. So this is also what we are currently looking at. We have, in terms of categories, of spend in terms of procurement. So we're also currently looking at that, and we will submit through. We're busy asking departments for the information, or rather we have populated the annexures and we've sent it out and we're asking them to look at that, and so we're looking at putting that application through to the National Treasury within this week still.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to deal with a question around slide 17, and also about especially the health department on slide 17. So firstly, in terms of the table on slide 17, that represents in terms of head count. So that is in terms of our number of staff. So what the table is indicating to you that as a 21-22 financial year, we are expecting to end off with about 89,000 staff, and then that increases in 22-23, and decreasing in 23-24, and almost staying stable in 24-25. The last part of that graph, last part of the table then indicates what is the net change year on year. So the majority of the increase that we have from the 89,000 to the 92,000, we find in the Department of Education, as I indicated, and that is mainly for educators and then also for support at schools. So that's the increase you see in education of 2,862 additional staff members. Then within health, now the health is impacted in terms of the number of employees and staff members required in order for our response to COVID. And so, and of that COVID response has mainly been contract employment. And as we now find that COVID is now going into the mainstream of the health platform, we will then see a decrease in the contract of employment regarding COVID and in terms of our response for COVID. So that is the one reason for the major drop. The other is also then in terms of the Department of Health is also having to look at its service platform based on the fiscal envelope that they have received. And so I've indicated that the equitable share has decreased, especially in that middle year. And that's one of the reasons that they now need to also reduce their headcount. But what we do as part of our COE strategy is every year before we table a budget, we do make sure that in terms of the headcount that we have, and we're indicating for that financial year, is allowing the department to be able to respond to the services that it does require. So further detail on health and showing the trend of health that you'll see the impact COVID has had on its health numbers is on page 137 of the overview. And that shows you in terms of the trend that you'll see our health has increased their numbers through contract employment, and then you'll see that the decrease now in the 23-24 financial year. Then Chair, I think just to indicate then on the 48 million for the drought, unfortunately, as the HED is indicated, that is not for what they're currently experiencing. It is in terms of for livestock feed for farmers, the 48 million that we are tabling as part of this budget.
Okay. Colleagues, urgent follow-up questions I'm going to take now. Any urgent questions? Because we don't have much time left. I think this is actually the most rounds of questions we've had in a session like this, so I'm very impressed with us. Member Dugmore.
Chair, it's actually just, to be honest, it's a new question, which I don't think will take a lot of time to respond to. If there's time, so I have a new question. Must I go for it or must I wait? Yeah. No, it's just that on the issue of motor vehicle licenses, MEC, particularly to you, you know, I think there's generally a principle in our taxation that we support a progressive taxation, in the sense that at personal income tax level, the higher your own income is, the more tax you pay, etc. Now, when it comes to motor vehicle licenses, and obviously that is an area where we as a province collect, as I see it, and we actually determine, as I understand it, what the motor vehicle license should be. And if you set it too high, people go and get their motor vehicles renewed in another province and so on and so forth. But if one looks at the possibility of looking at motor vehicle licenses and saying that if you can afford to buy a 1 million rand Maserati, although they probably cost about 2 million, I wouldn't really know what they cost, but it's not on vehicle size, it's basically on the value of the vehicle that you buy, that you should then expect to pay more for your license to drive that car around, because surely people who can afford to buy cars at that cost could afford to pay a greater license. So can I just ask, what is your general view, and would the department under your leadership be prepared to sort of look at this issue about whether, in the context of national fiscal policy and our approach in the province, whether we could look at whether a progressive taxation in the context of motor vehicle license firstly would actually generate more income for the province, and whether it would be feasible to do it? Thanks.
Thanks, Chair.
Ek is baie bly wil vra antwoord. Hang net geaan vir my asseblief. Member Mvimbi. You can go ahead with your final question.
Dankie, voorsitter. It's basically not a question, just a follow-up on a follow-up, Chairperson. The reason I was raising the issue of the Khayelitsha District Hospital, and maybe if there is any allocation that is there, because I take it this as part of us trying to make an input into the final budget process, unless I hope it's not cast in stone. In view of some of the reports that have been coming out about that hospital, and the challenges that it's actually having, where you will hear news of people sleeping on the patients sleeping on the ground because there's not enough beds and so on. There are quite it's a district hospital that is actually serving quite a very big constituency, So I think a considerable amount, I don't want to say a substantial amount, a considerable amount actually should be actually looked into trying to see how some of its problem can actually be alleviated. I'm not an expert in the health field as to know whether how much can it be, but I think maybe a consideration needs to be made in that regard. Thank you, Chairperson.
Okay. My last is actually just more a comment than anything else. So I've been to Maritzburg now. I've been to Merweville now. I told the people of Nelspruit I will get there because of these locusts. I recently found out about the locusts in Laingsburg. That was this weekend. And I even sent a video to the Minister of Agriculture from my rental that I drove through. Shame I had to tell him, like, he must ignore my girly music. And I don't think people realize how hectic it is. When you drive through the locusts, I had to drive so slow, less than 20 kilometers an hour on these roads because I was scared that the car was going to go off the road. I was literally fearing for my life because these locusts are not just in front of you, they're on the ground. It's like when someone throws something on the roads and they want you to swerve. And it's not just this, the locusts are eating the crops. It's a food security. The fact that this is not a disaster, a declared disaster yet, it's frightening because there's only certain people with specialized skills spraying foot on the locusts, and you can only do it at certain times during the day. And then while I do understand that this needs to go to agriculture, it is also something that we need to fight on a national. Disaster relief money for the mandate of the national government. And it's also a little bit worrying that the drought money we're getting is only for livestock, because it brings another question to my mind. What is happening to our fruit and vegetable farmers who are within those drought-stricken areas, who are not getting the fodder, for example, for their livestock, because they don't have livestock. They have what do you call it, like table grapes, and you have your vineyards and your orchards and things like that. So essentially, does that mean that if you're in a drought area, that you're actually not going to get any of the disaster management money? It's very concerning for me, and I will take it up with some of my colleagues within the Agriculture Committee as well. But that is just the general comment from my side. Please, if you're ever in the Karoo area, please go drive through those areas. Experience for yourselves what those locusts are doing. They are so hectic. They are currently in the town area of Beaufort. I went to the Tucson Center and I drove through locusts to get to the Tucson Center. I went to the store and I drove through locusts to get to the store. It is not a problem that's only on the farms anymore. It's not a problem that's only on the rural roads anymore. They've gone through so much, and now you're essentially fighting against locusts as well. But please, if that can be taken up in terms of, because disaster money is essentially grant money as well. I know that you guys have a directorate for things like grant money and understanding the conditions for grant money coming to the provinces. But bande word geskeer and cars are being wrecked and people are being attacked. The farmers don't have any more money left. They don't. They literally don't. And it's impacting on the food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Mvimbi, on the Khayelitsha District Hospital. I think that's possibly something, because the funding for the district hospitals is contained in Program 2, and there might be some funding in Program 4. in the case of Khayelitsha District Hospital on the vote of the Department of Health, vote 6. So I think to better understand the operating budget of the Khayelitsha District Hospital would be something that would be worth taking up in the committee with the department directly, and they'd be, I think, able to provide much more information on the particular pressures that are facing that facility and also what their strategy is to do about it. What the department has become very good at doing, and I think it's been one of the things they've learned from COVID, is how to manage the health system overall as a single platform. Rather than just individual facilities sinking or swimming by themselves. So they're able to they've been able to de-escalate, re-escalate services right across the whole platform, and I know that they manage that on a day-by-day basis. And so I think that you would be able to get a lot more information on what are some of the drivers of those particular pressures that the facility is facing at the moment. Honourable Bartman, on the question of the locusts, absolutely. I mean, I don't think for one moment we think that it's not a potentially very, very serious matter for the farmers and the communities who are being affected by this. The question is when it is triggered as a disaster, and then the funding that flows from that. From what you're reporting now, it does sound to me more severe than what I had understood it to be, but I will certainly have a discussion with my colleague, the HOD of Agriculture. And I'm sure he's a very experienced man, so I'm sure I'll get a lot of sense from him on exactly what's happening with the progression of the swarms and what the management strategy is at the moment. And I know that they'll be deeply concerned about the impacts on agriculture as well. I'll also check in with my colleague, the head of the Department of Local Government, which is where the Disaster Management Centre resides. So they would normally advise once they're starting to see these pressures coming through, and so maybe I haven't been as attentive to my phone as I should have in the last week or so as we've been bringing the budget into land. Oh, okay, good. Oh, well, you're not alone with Beyonce. And I think, Minister, you wanted to talk on the.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern, Chair, on the don't let me start on the locust. I spent Christmas and New Year's in the northern Karoo, in the eastern Cape part of the Karoo, and the problem has been quite serious for a number of months. So I think there needs to be a coordinated strategy between the three provinces. We had very severe locusts, obviously, over Christmas and New Year's. Also, similar stories, unable to get back as a result of locusts actually beginning to dam up the radiators of the cars, which is quite a scary experience. So it is certainly something to follow up with the national government in terms of that.
Thank you. And then the question on motor vehicle licenses. I'm not an expert on motor vehicle licenses. Of course, I do think that there is a risk with sort of differential pricing and possible migration of revenue streams, but it's certainly something that we are happy to look at. And from the question, I conclude that the Leader of Opposition clearly. I was just saying that we're quite happy to look at your proposal, and I conclude from your proposal that you do not drive a Maserati.
Soon. If I did, I will pay more.
If I can just add, the motor vehicle license fees are structured around both the weight of the vehicle and the engine size of the vehicle. So that's not necessarily an excellent proxy for the value of the vehicle. I mean, I don't know much about cars myself, but a Maserati, one of these things may have like a 1.5 liter engine in it. And then, so it may not be the perfect structuring of the base for this. And it's certainly something that we can have a look at. There's another emerging lacuna here, which I think Roy Haverman's been pointing out to us, is that electric vehicles don't have an engine size as conventionally defined. And so we may need to really relook at what the base that the license is applied to is. They certainly have a value, and they certainly have a weight, and I understand they're quite heavy. because of the batteries in them. So exactly how this plays out in the licensing is something that we would need to look at. So it's definitely an issue. It's definitely an issue that I think is coming increasingly on the table, and of course, this is a significant revenue source for the Western Cape government, and we want to get it right. We want to have an efficient, effective tax that is as productive as it can be.
I was having a look at some of those electric vehicle prices because I thought maybe I can be a cool kid, but those prices are not cool kid prices. And then you still have to install your own electric plug thing. Travel quite frequently. Colleagues, I'm going to close the question and answer session so much. Thank you so much for the members, obviously, for their questions, for the robustness, to Minister HOD and your delegation, as well as from the Premier's office, Ms. Ishmael. Thank you so much for being here and for assisting us in unpacking some of this quite comprehensive information. The respective votes and information for the respective departments will now be sent to their respective committees for consideration. Once the committees have gone through their respective votes for consideration, the committees will each individually report back to the Budget Committee on how. Once they have done so, 8:30 in the morning, consider all the votes and how they were considered by the Budget Committee will then make a consideration in its totality, which it will then make a recommendation to the House in this regard. Minister, HOD and delegation, you may now be excused. Please go and live your lives with your families. The committee members, I just want to find out if there's any specific requests for information. If none, then the votes in this regard will be referred to the respective committees. Remember, Dagmo, I see you just sighed all of a sudden now. I'm not sure if you forgot to ask something. No problem. Thank you so much. Colleagues, with that, the meeting's adjourned. Please go live your lives.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Chairperson.